Herkeneth to me gode men, weavers, maidens and alle men, of a tale that ich will you tell, whoso it will here and there to dwell. That was the opening of Havelock the Dane, a Middle English romance from the end of the 13th century. I'm going to tell you a little bit about medieval romance today. Medieval romance is a very, very popular story form that was found commonly from the 12th to the 15th centuries all throughout Western Europe. We do also see stories that are influenced heavily by romances, or could be called romances, in the 16th, even 17th century, and arguably even till the present day. It's a very, very influential form of storytelling. Susan Crane defines medieval romance as secular fictions of nobility, although it's worth noting that there are some pious romances, particularly in the 15th century. For example, Sir Isumbras is a good example of a pious romance. As the name suggests, they focus on nobles, on knights and their adventures, noble women. It's thought that the genre developed from the epic in the early Middle Ages. And we see romances, as I said, throughout Western Europe, particularly in France. This is where the genre was born. We see romances in Occitan, Provençal, Old French. We see a lot of romances in England as well. We see Anglo-Norman romances, which is the language in England post-conquest that mixes previous English and French. So it's a sort of transitional language. And then we see a lot of Middle English romances later. There's also romances in Italy, Spain. There's even a whole category of chivalric sagas in Iceland and in Scandinavia that are translations or adaptations of French stories. Mostly romances are anonymous, but in France authors tend to name themselves more readily. For example, Chrétien de Troyes is a very, very influential early romance writer. There's two romance writers called Thomas. One is Thomas of Britain, one is just Thomas. But in Middle English romance, the authors tend not to name themselves. They tend to be anonymous, although we do have some romances by what we call canonical authors, that is, authors whose work is deemed to be of literary merit and therefore is included in teaching commonly. So think like Shakespeare, Chaucer. Chaucer has arguably a romance. Sir Thomas Malory, his Morte d'Arthur is a romance. So, what are the features of medieval romance? How do you tell this text you have is a romance and not any other kind of text? So romances can be in verse or in prose. In verse, for example, they could be written in couplets, like Havelock the Dane, which I read at the beginning, which rhymes A-A-B-B and rhymes all the way through. Another common verse form is called tale rhyme. This is where your lines rhyme A-A-B, A-A-B. And so there's a couplet, and there's the tail rhyme line, which is the B rhyme line, and that rhyme will continue across lots of units. This rhyming form was actually mocked by Chaucer in his tale Sir Topaz, which is part of the Canterbury Tales, which is usually regarded as Chaucer making fun of the genre of romance and drawing attention to its features that are deemed as less desirable and less literary, whatever that means for the Middle Ages. So romances tend to be very, very formulaic. What I mean by this is two things. Firstly, the text as a whole is made up of small units that get repeated across romances, and even in the same romance. Little taglines, such as describing the lady in the romance as being white as whale's bone. The knight, the hero of the romance, could be doughty indeed. And you see these formulas repeated and repeated and repeated. It's also formulaic in a larger sense, in a wider scale, in that the stories are kind of made up of common units, and events get repeated across romances in slightly different ways. For example, giant fights are a common occurrence in Middle English romance. We see giant fights in Sir Bevis of Hampton, Sir Eglamour. So basically, formulaic means there are common features and lines even that are repeated and repeated. The structure of romance in general is a quest or a journey. There's usually one hero who has to go and do a thing, or a thing is forced upon him by the evils of the world, or the evils of stepfathers, or something like that. For that example, we would call that structure exile and return. A good example of that is King Horn, where Horn is exiled from his rightful kingdom and has to journey around and look after himself and eventually plot revenge so he can return and claim his rightful land and kingdom and woman. So love, courtly love, if we could call it that, although there's a bit of debate in scholarly circles about that term at the moment. But as you would think, perhaps from the name romance, love is very, very central. Actually, this is more of a later connection, because the name romance comes from the name for the French language, roman, rather than it being specifically related to love. So what else? Oh, I think I have just enough time to briefly touch on my favourite aspect of Middle English romance, and romance in general, which is what we call the oral versus written debate. And this may get a bit in-depth and nerdy, so let's see how we go. So the oral versus written debate is part of a wider scholarly debate that questions the composition of texts. For example, Beowulf is a really good example of, or even the Iliad, to go to the original kind of text that was debated. It was argued that very early texts were part of oral culture, which means that a text wasn't read from a book. A text was spontaneously rewritten, if you can use that term, in the moment of performance, using the performer's internal catalogue of formulas, which we talked about earlier. So a performer would know the story of Beowulf or the Iliad and would re-perform it, read it anew, perform it anew every time. And then it was only later that these texts were actually written down. But this idea becomes quite contentious in the Middle Ages, because by this point literacy is more widely spread, particularly in the 15th century. Literacy is a lot more widely spread than people expect, I think. So it's not quite so clear that texts could have been composed spontaneously and orally. People tend to argue that they were written down and then performed. Or maybe someone heard a performer or a minstrel and thought, oh yeah, that's good, I'm going to adapt that. My view of the matter is that I don't think we should have one or the other. I think it's both. I think there's a lot of different forms of texts going around in society. And we shouldn't focus just on oral or written, but I think it's very likely that romances, particularly in the 15th century, were read aloud communally. And that's the end of my time. I could go on for even longer about this, but let's stop it right there.